The true story of Noah's Ark, a faith that can move mountains. Imagine for a moment that you're standing on the edge of a world teetering on the brink of destruction. All around you, everything seems to be crumbling, both in the physical and moral sense. The world is darkened by sin, corrupted by violence and evil, and the cries of the innocent echo in the winds. But then there's a man, one man, standing firm in the midst of it all, holding on to something greater than himself, a faith so unshakable that it refuses to bow down to the chaos around him. That man is Noah. And the story of Noah's Ark is not just a tale of animals, rain, and a boat. It is a powerful testament to the strength of faith, obedience, and God's unwavering promise. In a world where doubts are plenty and hope can seem distant, Noah's story resonates deeply. It speaks to us of a faith that does not waver when faced with impossible odds, a faith that acts even when everyone else mocks, doubts, or walks away. It's the kind of faith that pushes through all obstacles, that builds when the world tells you it's pointless, and that holds on when everything else is falling apart. But before we dive into the details of the ark, the animals, and the floodwaters, let's take a moment to reflect on something bigger. What this story means for you and me today. We often hear Noah's Ark referenced as a tale from the past, a myth even, something we're meant to reflect on. But what if I told you that the lessons within it could change how we view our own challenges? The ark isn't just a relic of ancient history. It's a living symbol of God's protection, of His judgment, and of His unending grace. It's about more than surviving a storm. It's about trusting in God's plan even when you don't see the whole picture. There's a lot we can learn from Noah. Faith isn't about understanding every single detail. It's about trust. It's about taking the first step, even when the road is unclear. We might not be building a massive boat, but we're all building something in our lives. Perhaps it's a family, a career, a relationship, or a dream. And like Noah, we're often faced with moments when we have to decide, do we trust in the plan, or do we shrink back because we can't see the end? So, as we walk through the story of Noah's Ark, let it serve as a reminder. We're not just reading ancient history. We're encountering a faith that calls us to action, a faith that calls us to trust, even when it feels like the whole world is laughing at us or telling us to give up. This isn't just Noah's story, it's ours. The lessons he learned in building the ark are the very same lessons we need to apply in our own lives today. As we unpack the journey of Noah, remember that it's not just about the animals or the ark. It's about the faith that moved a man to do something extraordinary in the face of ridicule. It's about a God who sees the bigger picture when we can't. It's about knowing that no matter the storm, God's promises will always stand firm. Chapter 1. The World Before the Flood. As we look back at the time before Noah's flood, we see a world that feels eerily familiar in some ways. It wasn't just a little bit broken. It was entirely, deeply corrupt. It was a place where evil had seeped into every corner of society, where violence ran rampant, and where people had completely turned their backs on the Creator. In Genesis, we read that the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. This was a world that had lost its way, a place where sin had taken root so deeply that it seemed like hope was lost. Can you imagine living in a world like that? A world where every day you saw more of the same, people treating each other with cruelty, where hatred and greed overshadowed love, and where righteousness was nothing but a fading memory. It wasn't just a few bad apples here and there, it was systemic. It was everywhere. And in the midst of it all, there was Noah. What stands out to me in this story is not just the brokenness of the world, but the contrast of Noah. We're told that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord not because he was perfect, but because he walked with God. Imagine what it must have been like for him. He was one man in a world full of people who rejected God. But Noah didn't let the chaos around him pull him down. Instead, he chose to stand firm, to keep his faith intact, and to walk in God's ways even when everyone else was heading in the opposite direction. It's so easy, in a world filled with distractions, to feel like we're the only ones trying to do the right thing. We might not be surrounded by the extreme violence or corruption that Noah faced, but we often find ourselves in situations where it feels like living a life of integrity, kindness, or faithfulness isn't the popular choice. But Noah shows us something incredibly important. Faith doesn't depend on the world around us. It's about what we choose to believe in, what we choose to stand for, even when it's difficult. Noah was living in a society where it seemed like no one cared about what was right anymore, yet his faithfulness to God set him apart. And here's the beauty of it. It's not about being perfect. It's about choosing God's ways over the ways of the world. It's about standing strong even when everyone else has given in. And while the world Noah lived in was filled with destruction, his story teaches us that even in the most broken places, a life of faith can shine through. When everything around us feels dark and uncertain, we have the opportunity to be like Noah, to be people who trust God, hold on to his promises, and live with integrity. That's the kind of life that changes the world, even if it starts with just one person. Chapter 2. God's command to Noah. One day, in the middle of this world that seemed beyond saving, God speaks to Noah. He gives Noah a command that, at the time, must have sounded utterly insane. God tells Noah to build an ark, a massive boat that would save him, his family, and pairs of every kind of animal from the coming flood. Now imagine for a second what that must have been like for Noah. He was living in a world that had rejected God. He was surrounded by people who mocked the very idea of God's judgment. And then, God asks him to build a giant boat in the middle of a place that had never seen rain before. At that moment, Noah had a choice. He could have ignored God's command. He could have written it off as foolishness. After all, who would believe that a flood, a massive global flood, was coming? But Noah didn't hesitate. He trusted God. He believed in God's word even when he couldn't see how it would all work out. And that's where the faith begins. Building the ark wasn't just about the structure. It was about Noah's obedience. It was about doing what God asked even when it didn't make sense. Even when no one else believed, even when the world seemed to mock him, Noah got to work. And this is where we find one of the most powerful lessons from his story. Obedience isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. I think sometimes we get caught up in the idea that faith should always feel good, that it should be easy or obvious. But real faith isn't about knowing exactly how things will turn out. It's about trusting God, even when the path forward isn't clear. It's about taking that first step, even when it doesn't make sense, because we know God is leading us. Noah could have questioned God. He could have wondered why he was the one chosen. He could have been afraid of what others would think. But instead, Noah simply obeyed. And by doing so, he set the stage for the greatest act of God's salvation up to that point in history. The ark was going to take years to build, and Noah had no guarantee that anyone would listen to him. But he kept going. Every hammer strike, every piece of wood, every nail he hammered in was an act of faith. It wasn't just about building a boat. It was about building a legacy of trust in God's promises. Noah's story reminds us that obedience isn't always easy, but it's always a step toward God's greater plan. Sometimes we might be asked to take big leaps of faith or do things that seem impossible. But when we choose to obey, we partner with God in His work. Just like Noah, we don't have to know all the answers. We just have to trust that God's commands are always good, even when the world around us doesn't understand. Chapter 3. Noah's faith in action. As Noah set to work on the ark, the task before him must have seemed overwhelming. After all, this wasn't just building a small boat to sail on a lake. This was a massive undertaking that would take years. Imagine having to gather materials, cut and shape wood, and construct a vessel that would house Noah, his family, and every kind of animal in the world. And all of this had to be done in a time when people didn't understand what rain was, let alone a flood of this magnitude. Yet in the face of this monumental challenge, Noah's faith wasn't passive. His faith wasn't just about believing that God would save him. It was about taking action. And this is where we see the difference between a faith that believes and a faith that works. Noah didn't just wait around for the flood to come. He didn't sit back and say, I trust God, so I'll just let things happen. No, he trusted God, and then he got to work. He showed up every day, faithfully working on the ark, doing what God had asked him to do, even when no one understood, even when it seemed pointless. Think about it. Every time Noah hammered a nail or sawed a plank, he was taking a step of faith. He was putting his trust in God's word, even when the results weren't immediately visible. This is such a powerful lesson for us today. How often do we find ourselves waiting for God to act, to show us the way, and yet we're not putting in the effort to follow through on what he's already told us? Noah teaches us that faith isn't just about believing that something will happen. It's about stepping out in obedience and taking action, even when we don't see the end result right away. I think we can all relate to that feeling of uncertainty. We've all been there, right? Whether it's starting a new job, launching a new project, or even trying to build a relationship, we can feel that fear creeping in. What if it doesn't work out? What if people laugh at me? What if it's all for nothing? But Noah's story shows us that faith in action means moving forward even when we don't have all the answers. We don't have to know how everything will turn out. We just have to trust God enough to start the work and then keep going day by day. And let's not forget Noah's family. They weren't sitting back either. They were right there with him, supporting the work, doing their part. I imagine that, like Noah, they were also faced with doubt, with the ridicule of others, with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But they chose to trust Noah's leadership and follow God's plan. This is such a beautiful reminder of the power of family and community in our faith journeys. Sometimes it's not just about us, but about the people we surround ourselves with. Noah's story shows us that we're not meant to walk this path alone. We need each other to build the ark in our lives, to encourage each other, and to take those steps of faith together. Noah's faith wasn't a passive thing. It was a living, breathing action. He didn't just believe in God's promises. He built something that reflected that belief. And that's exactly what we're called to do. We're called to take the things we believe in and act on them, to build the life, the relationships, and the future that God has planned for us, even when it doesn't make sense. Chapter 4. The Gathering of the Animals. As the ark began to take shape, Noah didn't just continue working on the boat, he also had a task that might have seemed just as impossible. He was told by God to gather every kind of animal onto the ark. Imagine trying to round up animals from all over the world. There were no planes, no trains, no trucks to transport them. No. Instead, Noah had to wait for God to bring them to him. And here's where things get even more incredible. In the Bible, it tells us that the animals came to Noah. The idea of animals of all kinds, from the wildest to the tame, all walking in pairs toward the ark, is both surreal and miraculous. God was orchestrating the entire process. Noah didn't have to search the land for every single animal. He just had to trust God's plan and wait for it to unfold. And that's exactly what happened. Each pair of animals, male and female, came to Noah just as God had promised. Can you picture that? It's one thing to believe that God can do big things, but it's another to watch him carry them out in ways that you could never have imagined. The miracle of the animals gathering wasn't just a sign of God's power, it was a sign of his provision. God knew exactly what Noah needed, and he made sure that everything was in place. All Noah had to do was follow through on the instructions he'd been given. Now, think about how this applies to us. There are moments in our lives when we're asked to trust God in ways that seem beyond our comprehension. We might feel like we're facing an impossible situation. Maybe it's a project that feels too big, a relationship that feels too broken, or a dream that feels too distant. And in those moments, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But just like Noah, we're called to trust in God's provision. We don't have to figure everything out on our own. We don't have to make all the pieces fit. God is at work behind the scenes, bringing things together in ways we can't always see. Noah's faith was tested in those moments of waiting. He had to trust that God would bring what was needed, even when it didn't make sense. And here's the beauty of it. Just as God brought the animals to Noah, he brings the right opportunities, the right people, and the right moments into our lives at the perfect time. We don't have to force things. We just have to be obedient, show up, and trust that God will do the rest. But there's also a deeper lesson here. The animals didn't just show up because Noah asked them to. They came because God directed them. And this is such a crucial part of our faith journey. We might feel like we're doing everything we can to make something happen, but sometimes the best thing we can do is wait for God's timing. He knows exactly when to bring the right things into our lives. And just as He brought the animals to Noah, He will bring the right opportunities, the right resources, and the right support at just the right moment. As Noah stood at the entrance of the ark, looking at the animals marching in, he must have realized something powerful. He wasn't in control of everything. He was just obeying, just trusting, and that was enough. Sometimes we need to remember that our role is to be faithful, not to be in control. We act in obedience, and God takes care of the rest. In the end, Noah's faith wasn't just about building the ark or gathering the animals. It was about trusting God in the small moments, the quiet moments, and the waiting moments. It was about knowing that God was working even when Noah couldn't see it. And that's the kind of faith that we're called to today. Faith that trusts, even in the waiting, knowing that God is always at work. Chapter 5. The deluge begins. And then the moment came. The skies darkened, the winds began to howl, and the earth began to tremble. No one could have prepared for what was about to unfold. For Noah, the flood that God had promised was no longer a distant warning. It was a reality. The rain began to fall, and it didn't stop. For 40 days and 40 nights the heavens opened, and the earth below seemed to break apart. Imagine the sound of the first raindrops hitting the ground, followed by a downpour so relentless it soon turned into a torrent. The flood wasn't just a heavy rain. It was the beginning of God's judgment on a world that had chosen wickedness over righteousness. For Noah and his family, all they could do was trust. They had done what God had asked them to do. They had built the ark, gathered the animals, and followed every detail of God's instructions. Now they were inside the ark, surrounded by their loved ones and the creatures of the earth, waiting. And as the rain continued to fall, I can only imagine what they must have felt. The sounds of the storm outside, the knowledge that they were safe inside, yet the reality of the world being wiped away must have been overwhelming. There had to be a sense of grief for the people outside the ark, for those who had chosen to ignore the warnings and had no shelter from the flood. It's easy to think of the flood as something distant, something that happened long ago. But there's a powerful lesson in the flood that we can apply to our lives today. The flood wasn't just about water covering the earth. It was about judgment, but also mercy. While the floodwaters raged outside, the ark remained steady, a place of refuge, a symbol of God's protection. And for Noah and his family, the ark wasn't just a boat. It was a place of safety in the midst of chaos, a reminder that even in the most terrifying moments, God's promises are true. In our lives, we often face floods of our own. Not literal floods, but times when life feels overwhelming, when the challenges seem too great, when everything around us feels like it's crashing down. It's hard to remember that God is our refuge. But just as He provided a safe place for Noah, He promises to be our refuge in times of trouble. The ark, in a way, is a symbol of God's faithfulness. It's the reminder that when the storms of life rage, God's protection remains. The flood may come, but His promises never fail. As Noah and his family sat in the ark, surrounded by the roaring storm, they had no way of knowing exactly when it would end. They didn't know how long they would be confined to the ark. All they could do was wait, trust, and hold on to the knowledge that God was in control. And that's where we find our own lessons. When the storms come, we don't always know how long they will last. We don't know when the rain will stop or when the waters will recede, but we do know that God is with us. Just as He protected Noah, He promises to protect us, and that is a truth we can hold on to, no matter how fierce the storm. Chapter 6. Inside the Ark. Inside the ark, life was far from normal. While the world outside was being swept away by the floodwaters, Noah and his family were on a journey of their own. They weren't just waiting for the storm to end. They were living in the midst of it, taking care of the animals, maintaining the ark, and supporting each other through the uncertainty. The ark wasn't just a place of safety, it became a place of action. Every day there were things to do. There was work to be done to keep the ark afloat, to care for the animals, and to ensure that everyone had what they needed to survive. And yet, even with all the work that needed to be done, I imagine that there were moments of quiet reflection. The sounds of the storm outside must have been constant, a reminder of the world that was no more. In those moments, Noah and his family had to trust in what they couldn't see. They had to hold on to the belief that God was working, even when it didn't seem like anything was changing. They were in the middle of the storm, but the ark was a tangible reminder that they were safe in God's care. There's a lesson for us in the way Noah's family lived in the ark. Life in the ark wasn't easy, but it was necessary. They couldn't rush the process, they had to endure the wait. Sometimes, in our own lives, we find ourselves in situations where we can't control the circumstances. We're stuck in a waiting period, in a place of uncertainty where it feels like nothing is happening. But the truth is, even in those waiting periods, God is at work. Just as He kept Noah and his family safe inside the ark, He is with us during our own seasons of waiting. And it's not just about waiting passively, it's about trusting while we act. Inside the ark, Noah and his family were actively working. They were taking care of what God had entrusted to them. They weren't just waiting for the flood to end. They were living each day with purpose, fulfilling the responsibilities God had given them. And that's something we can all learn from. It's easy to get frustrated when we're in a season of waiting. We might wonder why things aren't moving forward as quickly as we'd like, but often, the waiting is a time for us to focus on what God has given us right now. What responsibilities has He placed in our hands? What can we do today to keep moving forward, even if the big picture isn't clear yet? Just as Noah and his family worked together to maintain the ark, we're called to work together in our own lives, especially in times of uncertainty. The journey may feel long and the storm may seem endless, but if we keep trusting God and taking action with what He's given us, we'll see that He is faithful to carry us through. The ark wasn't just a boat. It was a place where faith met action. And that's what we're called to do in our own lives. Trust God's plan, even when we can't see the outcome, and keep moving forward with faith and purpose. Chapter 7. The End of the Flood. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, the rain stopped. The storm that had seemed relentless, the floodwaters that had covered the earth, began to recede. Slowly but surely the waters began to calm, and the ark that had been carried through the chaos now floated gently on the surface of a world that was changing. The quiet after the storm must have been almost as overwhelming as the storm itself. Can you imagine what Noah and his family must have felt, sitting in the ark hearing the sounds of the floodwaters ebbing away, realizing that the worst was finally over? But even in this moment of relief, there was still a sense of waiting. The ark was still floating, the earth was still flooded, and Noah and his family didn't know exactly when they could step out and begin anew. They didn't know how long it would take for the earth to dry, for the land to become habitable again. Yet in that uncertainty, Noah's faith never wavered. God had promised that He would bring them through, and Noah believed that promise. It's in these waiting periods, after the storm has passed but before we can see the fruits of that promise, that our faith is truly tested. It's easy to trust God when things are clear, when the rain is falling and we're actively doing something, but what about when the waters have receded and we're left in the stillness, unsure of the next step? That's when the waiting feels the hardest. We can't rush the process. The world around us may seem to be standing still, and we may wonder if anything is changing, but God's timing is perfect. In Noah's case, he waited for the waters to recede and for God's instruction on when to leave the ark. He didn't rush it. He trusted God's plan, even when the path forward wasn't immediately clear. And in the same way, we are often asked to wait, not passively but actively, trusting in God's timing and following the path He has laid before us. Sometimes the end of the storm is not the end of the waiting, but like Noah, we must remain patient knowing that God's promises are true and His timing will always be perfect. When the dove Noah had sent out returned with an olive leaf, it was a tangible sign that the earth was healing, that life was returning. It was a sign of hope, and for Noah and his family, it must have been a profound moment, a reminder that the destruction was not the end, but the beginning of something new. The storm had cleared, and now the promise of renewal was right in front of them. Chapter 8. The Covenant with Noah. As the ark finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat and the earth began to dry, Noah and his family could finally step out. They had waded through the storm, they had endured the uncertainty, and now, God was going to give them something truly remarkable. After Noah and his family had made a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God, the Creator made a covenant with Noah, a promise that would echo through all generations. God told Noah that never again would he flood the earth to destroy all life. As a sign of this promise, he placed a rainbow in the sky. The rainbow would forever serve as a reminder of God's covenant with humanity. Every time Noah or his descendants would see the rainbow, they would be reminded of God's faithfulness, His mercy, and His promise to never again bring such a flood. It's a beautiful moment, isn't it? The rainbow, with all its colors, represents more than just a natural phenomenon. It represents God's mercy and faithfulness. It's a visual reminder that, even in the midst of the darkest storms, there is always hope. It's God's way of saying, "I will never leave you, and I will never break my promises." For Noah, this covenant was not just a promise for him and his family, it was a promise for all of humanity. God was making a way forward, a fresh start, a new beginning, after the devastation of the flood. And the covenant wasn't just about the floodwaters, it was about the future. God was giving Noah and his descendants a new purpose, a new responsibility to fill the earth, to multiply, and to steward the land that God had created. God was trusting Noah and his family with the renewal of the world. And isn't that what God does in our lives too? Even when we go through difficult times, when it feels like we're surrounded by nothing but storm and darkness, God is always preparing us for something new. When the storm ends, it's not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to trust in God's promises. The rainbow, as simple and beautiful as it may be, is a powerful reminder. It tells us that even in the hardest moments of our lives, God's covenant is still at work. His promises are still true. His faithfulness remains. And as Noah looked up at that rainbow, I imagine he must have been filled with awe and gratitude, knowing that he and his family had been chosen to carry the weight of this promise forward. For us, the rainbow is a reminder that God is always at work, even when we can't see the full picture. When life feels uncertain, when we're in the middle of a storm, we can trust that God has already promised us His protection, His grace, and His faithfulness. Just as He was with Noah, He is with us, guiding us through the storms and into the new beginnings He has prepared for us. God's covenant with Noah is a promise that stretches far beyond the ark and the flood. It's a promise that echoes throughout history and continues to speak to us today. It's a promise that God will never leave us or forsake us, and that no matter how big the storm, His love and faithfulness will always remain. And every time we see a rainbow, we're reminded of that unbreakable promise. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Noah. Noah's story doesn't end with the ark, the flood, or the covenant. After the floodwaters had receded, Noah and his family were given the incredible task of rebuilding a world that had been wiped clean. God blessed Noah and his sons, telling them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. This was not just a return to normal. It was a new beginning. They were entrusted with the task of repopulating the earth, restoring what had been lost, and taking care of God's creation once more. In that moment, Noah and his family were the foundation of a new world, the very first steps of rebuilding everything that had been destroyed. Yet, despite this fresh start, Noah's story wasn't perfect. Like all of us, he wasn't immune to mistakes. The Bible tells us that Noah planted a vineyard, made wine, and became drunk. While it's easy to focus on the imperfections, what stands out is the grace that follows the mistakes. Noah was human, and like all of us, he stumbled. But the key point here is that even after the flood, even after the promise, Noah continued to be part of God's unfolding plan. Sometimes we look at our lives and think that our mistakes or failures define us. We look at the things we wish we had done differently or the choices we regret, and we can feel like we've fallen too far to be part of God's plan. But Noah's story shows us something incredibly important. God's purposes don't end with our mistakes. They continue even when we stumble. Just because we fall doesn't mean God's promise for us is over. Like Noah, we can keep moving forward, trusting that God's grace is bigger than our failures. Noah's legacy is not defined by the flood or his imperfections, but by his faith and obedience. His story reminds us that we're never too far gone to begin again. Each day is an opportunity to start fresh, to trust God again, and to step into the future He's prepared for us. After the flood, Noah became a symbol of faithfulness, not just to God's promises, but to the ongoing work of God's creation. He didn't just survive the flood, he contributed to the future of humanity. This is the legacy of Noah. Not perfection, but perseverance, faith, and a willingness to keep walking with God, even through the storm. Chapter 10. Lessons for today. So, what does Noah's story mean for us today? What can we take from this ancient narrative and apply to our lives in a world that's often just as broken as the one Noah lived in? The truth is, Noah's story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a timeless reminder of faith, trust, and obedience, even in the most difficult circumstances. One of the most important lessons from Noah's journey is the power of obedience. Noah didn't question God's plan. He didn't wait for everything to make sense. He simply trusted. In our own lives, we often find ourselves waiting for perfect circumstances or clear answers before we take action. We want to know exactly how things will turn out before we step forward. But Noah teaches us that sometimes obedience doesn't come with all the answers. Sometimes God asks us to step out in faith, trusting that He will provide along the way. Another powerful lesson from Noah's life is the importance of persistence. Building the ark wasn't a short task. It took years, and it was filled with challenges and doubts. Yet Noah continued to work day after day, trusting in God's promise. In our own lives, we face seasons of waiting, seasons when things don't seem to be moving forward as quickly as we'd like. But persistence is key. It's about showing up every day, doing what we know is right, and trusting that God is working even when we can't see the results. Noah also teaches us about the importance of faith in action. Faith isn't just about believing in God, it's about living out that belief in everything we do. When God asked Noah to build the ark, Noah didn't just pray about it. He didn't just talk about it. He got to work. He put his faith into action. In our own lives, faith without action is just a wish. It's about trusting God enough to step out, even when it's hard, and even when the results are uncertain. And finally, Noah's story reminds us that God's promises are always faithful. Even when the floodwaters seemed like they would never end, God remained true to His word. Just as He promised Noah that the flood would end, He promises us that He will never leave us or forsake us. No matter what storms we face in our own lives, we can trust that God is with us, guiding us, protecting us, and leading us through to the other side. In a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming, Noah's story gives us hope. It's a story of faith, perseverance, and the unwavering love of God. Just as Noah's faith in God's promises carried him through the storm, so can our faith carry us through the challenges we face today. So as you face your own storms, remember Noah. Remember his obedience, his persistence, and his trust in God. And know that just as God was faithful to Noah, He is faithful to you. The promise of a new beginning, of restoration, and of grace is yours too. Keep trusting. Keep moving forward. And just like Noah, you'll see God's faithfulness unfold in your life, one step at a time. Conclusion: walking in Noah's footsteps. As we look back at Noah's journey, we see more than just an ancient story. It's a powerful blueprint for how we are called to live out our own faith today. Noah wasn't perfect, but his unwavering trust in God, his commitment to obedience, and his willingness to act, even when the path seemed unclear, offer us lessons that resonate just as deeply now as they did thousands of years ago. Noah's story teaches us that faith isn't just about believing in something, it's about trusting enough to take action. It's about showing up day after day, even when the world around us might mock us, or when the task ahead seems too daunting. It's about doing the work, putting in the effort, and trusting God to do the rest. Noah didn't just wait for God's promise to be fulfilled, he worked in anticipation of it. That's the kind of faith we are called to. Faith that is active, that moves us to do what we can, while trusting God to handle what we can't. When Noah stepped onto the ark, it was an act of obedience, a step into the unknown, trusting God to keep his promise. And as we walk through our own lives, we too will face moments where stepping out in faith feels uncertain. But just like Noah, we can trust that God will never lead us into something without being with us every step of the way. The ark wasn't just a place of physical safety. It was a place where Noah's faith in God was protected, and where the promise of a future was kept safe. For us, the promise remains the same. Even when life feels like a storm, God is our refuge. He is our ark, and in him we are safe. But Noah's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about new beginnings. After the storm, when the waters receded, Noah and his family were tasked with rebuilding, with filling the earth again and renewing what had been lost. And so are we. Just as Noah stepped out of the ark and into a world that needed to be restored, we too are called to rebuild, to take the lessons we've learned through our own storms and use them to create something better. Whether it's in our relationships, our careers, or our communities, we have the opportunity to walk in Noah's footsteps by trusting God to use us for his greater purpose. Noah's covenant with God was a promise that was meant for all generations. When God placed the rainbow in the sky, he gave Noah and all of us a sign that no matter how dark the clouds may seem, there is always hope, always a promise of renewal. Just as Noah received the gift of the rainbow, we too can hold on to the promise that God is with us, that his plans for us are good, and that his love is unshakable. So, as you go forward in your own journey, remember Noah. Remember his faith, his obedience, and his perseverance. Even when the world around us seems lost, we can stand firm in the knowledge that God is faithful, that he will guide us, and that he will use our lives for his purpose. Just like Noah, we may not have all the answers, but we can trust the one who does. And as we walk in his footsteps, we will find the courage, the strength, and the hope we need to build, to restore, and to live out the promise of a future filled with his love and grace. So let's walk boldly, just as Noah did. Let's trust in God's promises, take action, and rebuild a world that reflects his goodness and faithfulness. And when we look to the sky, let's remember the rainbow, not just as a sign of hope for Noah, but as a reminder that God's promises are true for us too every single day.